You're on the air. Don't say anything crazy. Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Brobears Talk. And today, Andre and I will be discussing the magical wonders of wilderness and bushcraft survival.
That sounds absolutely fascinating, Brother Bear. I'm sure you can tell us a lot with the how many months have you been in Alberta now?
Well, it feels, since the pandemic hit, it feels like I've been here for well over a year now, just because time has been so distorted. But I've been here since the very end of February, so I caught the harsh winter, sort of the tail end of the harsh winter, and now I'm enjoying a glorious summertime here in Alberta. So it's just been a few months, really. It's been about 4 months.
Yeah, you're really lucky with the natural bounty of beauty, both flora and fauna. In fact, you sent me some incredible photos and a giant beaver that was crossing the road.
Yeah, so yesterday was my first fishing trip, and we got a bit distracted by
Did you catch any bonita?
We didn't catch any beautiful bonita fish, but I've heard they're big, right?
I don't know, are they? So yeah, bonita fish, they're a trophy fish, so yeah, they're pretty big.
If anyone got the Step Brothers reference, then I applaud you. We both applaud you.
Yes, and you have to subscribe if you did.
Hit subscribe now, because that's, any film that Joaquin Phoenix can watch over 50 times is one of the best ever made. So
that's the only endorsement you need.
Absolutely. But
Don't
yes,
take it from us, take it from Joaquin.
Yeah, we're just reinforcing Joaquin's filmic opinion. But take it from him.
Back to the beaver.
Back to this 3-foot beaver that came crawling out on the river. So
It was gigantic.
It was. It's so bizarre as well, because it looks. I mean, I don't know if a beaver is a rodent. Maybe it must be a giant rodent, or is it a mammal? Well, no, rodents are mammals, but I mean, I really don't know how to classify it. It's just it's such a strange creature, and the tail on that thing literally looks like a ping pong paddle. So
Did you see any evidence of their deforestation and dam building?
No. So it was on a lake, not a river. So
okay.
The purpose of the beaver dam is to sort of hold in water and reduce some of the discharge. But as it was in a lake setting, it was just there weren't really any dams or anything like that about.
Right. Okay.
But we didn't catch any fish, so I'm bloody glad that we saw a beaver.
Something. And then there was that insane storm, right, in the afternoon?
Yes, so we had a tornado warning, which is quite rare for the Calgary area. It's usually the Hicks and the Sticks usually get tornado warnings out in Saskatchewan or in eastern Alberta in towns like Irricana and Berserker. So if anyone's familiar with southern Alberta, these are like rural locations that look a lot like, for US listeners, a lot like Iowa or Illinois, sort of very sort of dusty, lots of corn. If anyone's seen the film, I don't know if you've seen this, What's Eating Gilbert Grape? Classic film set in the American Midwest with Johnny Depp and DiCaprio, but that's what sort of southern eastern Alberta looks like. It's just kind of it's very green in the summer, but for much of the winter it's sort of a dust bowl-y, dead brown terrain.
Yeah, it sounds like the opening scene of Interstellar, where there's just swathes of cornfields.
It's very much like the opening scene of Interstellar. You can imagine, the people living there. I buried my sister out back, and I buried my mother out back.
Matthew McConaughey, great actor. I would recommend any film with him in it.
Yeah. Oh God, yeah. One of the
great Texan man.
Very Texan man. One of the greatest actors of our time.
Indeed.
But yes, it was. So the tornado didn't really hit in the end, but we watched some amazing storm clouds and funnels forming from a fairly high point when it was at a safe distance. So we were just sort of watching the electrical storm, and you could almost see the clouds rubbing together, which was really quite amazing. And you suggested me getting a proper SLR camera, didn't you?
I think it'd be a shame not to. All of the natural wonder of the world out there. It would be a shame not to capture it sort of in years to come, to look back at that and just remember what an incredible part of the world you managed to live in. Because those clouds you sent me, I've never seen clouds like that over here in terms of the cumulonimbus, quite an atmospheric scene, especially with that lightning bolt in the background. I'm just trying to paint the picture for the viewers here, I think. And it was amazing because sort of in that same frame you had perfectly blue sky and then this almost snaking black, boiling black cloud with these prongs of lightning coming off it. It was quite incredible. Who caught that picture? Was that your picture, or was that someone else's? Plagiarized it, Leo?
Plagiarized, theft, intellectual theft. No, that was my picture. I mean, it was just it. You don't have to be a good photographer to.
No, you do.
Take
years of experience to catch that.
Decades of photography experience.
Some people have spent entire lives trying to catch a lightning bolt. And there you are, you plucky little Brit, managed to get it in one shot.
I got it, Dad. It really wasn't hard though, because the
was that frequent, was it?
It was so frequent that you could sort of rapid fire take pictures. Or
all right, just trying to give you some credit. Don't downplay it.
Just being modest, just being a modest Brit here. Yeah, I did it. It took a few hours to perfect, but I got there in the end.
I sat in the field for the 5 hours on the tripod. I used about 5 SD cards, each a terabyte.
Blew out a couple of hard drives with the amount of photography material on there, but it got there in the end.
We've been doing it for generations. No one's managed to do it.
It's all I know. My daddy,
all my family's ever done.
My granddaddy couldn't do it. His granddaddy couldn't do it, but I did it. But it was beautiful. And you're right. As geographers, the cumulonimbus formations are very interesting, especially when they go beyond, your usual puffy elephants you see in Britain, and you've got these shoots that almost seem to touch the floor, and turn into this sort of vague fog when you get to your alpine areas, and when you get an electrical storm, you actually see it hit the ground. That's something really quite special. You don't see that often.
Pow! But
Pow!
Top fact. I actually found out. Well, actually, this was years ago because I used to read encyclopedias as a child.
Yes.
But no, thanks to this much of the reading I did in encyclopedias, I found out that the color of a cloud, particularly the darker it is, only speaks to the relative thickness of the cloud. So the thicker the cloud, the darker it is, because essentially you're looking through more cloud, and therefore it absorbs more of the sun, and therefore it is perceived darker.
Oh, interesting.
So it just speaks to the thickness or the height of the cloud when you're looking from below. Does that make sense?
Yes, yeah. So it doesn't denote. You're saying it doesn't denote how much rainfall the cloud could store?
In kind of indirectly it does, because all it's saying is, or giving you an indication of how thick the cloud is. So in its darkest patches, that's where the cloud is highest, if you see what I mean. And that's why cumulonimbus clouds are typically the darkest clouds we see, because they are the tallest and therefore the thickest, and therefore they don't let much sunlight through in their thickest points.
Oh, interesting.
Does that make sense?
That does make sense. So indirectly, they'll have a higher propensity to shed precipitation.
Indeed, because there's that much more water in them. But it's more about their relative darkness relates to the thickness as opposed to sheer water. But yes, water, I suppose, is directly proportional to the thickness as well.
Interesting.
And Brother Bear, actually, I saw a really interesting article about this. I think it was the record largest lightning strike ever recorded, and it was insane. It stretched around 400 miles across multiple states in the United States.
What?
Yes.
Wait, are you saying that you could view it from 400 miles?
No.
What do you say?
It was the network of that bolt stretched laterally from left to right, it was that was the shape of it across 3 states,
Bloody
400
hell.
miles. Yeah,
That's
it was
crazy.
insane. It was like a super bolt.
Super bolt.
And I think it's called sheet lightning. And sheet lightning, I believe, and this may be completely wrong, but do check it out, Wikipedia guys, if this is all wrong, and do call me out on it. But sheet lightning, to my understanding, is lightning that propagates laterally or horizontally through a cloud, as opposed to actually making contact anywhere with the ground. So it doesn't actually make landfall anywhere. It just propagates horizontally through a cloud network.
Right, so it doesn't come into contact with the Earth. It
Right,
just
there's not a
stretch
bolt
across.
that there's no bolt that discharges. It's simply a bolt that moves laterally through the cloud, sometimes for vast distances, like it was, like in this case.
That's bizarre.
No
I
idea.
think I think we definitely saw some sheet lightning then last night, because there was a whole bunch of lightning that didn't connect with the ground but just flashed, and it was like a massive web that would cross. I mean, we're talking about 10 to 15 kilometers in length, and that was really quite special to look at. And then you've got the bolts that are hitting the ground, and you literally think, is that God smiting someone? It's just...
Well, it's incredible, because sheet lightning is one of the most spectacular visually, because it almost lights up the entire cloud, especially at night. Oh, here we are. Jamie's pulled it up for me. Thanks, Jamie. Sheet lightning, also known as intra-cloud lightning, refers to lightning within a cloud that lights up as a sheet of luminosity during a flash. So it's intra-cloud lightning. So I was pretty much on point.
Yeah. Thank you, Andre. And thank you, Jamie, for pulling that up.
No worries. Thanks,
That.
Jamie.
Thanks, Jamie.
We can't afford Jamie yet, so we're pretending we've got one.
We're not really outsourcing it to anyone yet, so we've sort of developed an imaginary friend there. But that's quite interesting. I mean, the lighting up of the sky, though, is a beautiful phenomenon, especially when you're in a wooded area at night. And
Leo, you told me about this. Please tell the full story, because yeah, go on, just paint the picture.
Oh, so this happened to me when I got up. I was out wild camping in Kananaskis country, which is this beautiful area, sort of the foothills of the Rockies west of Calgary. And I got up to take a leak, pitch black, nothing around, and no sources of artificial light whatsoever. And
so you couldn't see your hand if you stuck it out in front of you?
I couldn't see my hand if I stuck it out in front of me. It was incredibly dark.
Most people have no concept of darkness like that.
Well, it's quite rare, isn't it? Especially in outdoor situations, because outdoor, especially in southern Britain, there's always going to be some light coming from somewhere.
Light pollution's a big problem nowadays, isn't it?
It is all around the world, and I think people go for the blackout curtain sort of thing because that's the closest you're going to get. But this situation, it was pitch black, and so I walked down to the creek because I knew sort of roundabouts where it was. It was only about a 10-meter walk, and then suddenly we got this lightning strike, and it. You know what? Have you ever ridden on the tube in London and suddenly the lights have gone out, and you're riding at night and it's been all dark, and then it just goes off, and then suddenly you get all the lights come back on again. Has that ever happened to you?
Yeah, absolutely.
So it was like that, but it was the reverse. So it was kind of like that, but I got a full 3 or 4 seconds, which is longer than I expected, of just the bright as day light, and I could see everything. The entire woods were illuminated, Brother Bear. I could see the creek. I could see the trees. Everything in beautiful Technicolor. Everything was suddenly back, and it was like, God, it's like someone switched on the daylight. God just went boom, like here's daylight just for a few seconds, for 3 or 4 seconds, and then it went back to plunged into that sort of darkness that you'd only sort of equate to being down a deep dark mine.
Yeah. Well, that's a surreal experience for the vast majority of people, but I suppose back in the day when we were hunter-gatherers, that would have been a very relatively common occurrence to sort of witness lightning in its full glory, where you see it against the contrast of a perfectly dark night, unpolluted, unfettered darkness.
Yes, unfettered, untampered with.
Punctuated by bolts, brilliant flashes, where it just suddenly, because I have seen something very similar to what you describe out in the country in Italy, and it's quite surreal. And I think if you're seeing it for the first time, it can have quite a profound effect on you.
Definitely. And was this must have been, was this rural Italy, up in the sort of the lakes area, or were you?
Yeah, it was Tuscany. Yeah, so, but it was up on a hill, and there was very little in the way of light pollution, and it was almost like an old villa. So there was nothing around for miles. It was quite isolated, quite standalone, and just lit up the entire hillside. It's almost like someone had just taken a massive picture.
You know what? That's a great way of putting it, because I was trying to put my finger on what it looked like, and it was like that picture flash that irritates the eyes because it's so sudden and bright. But just imagine that when it's not the daytime and when there's zero light influences coming from anywhere.
Yeah, that's incredible.
It's
and
really
so
special.
when you were camping out there, Brother Bessie, you set up camp. Did you cook anything? I want you to tell me, because you spent the night out in the wilderness, didn't you?
Yeah, so, and it's interesting you mention hunter-gatherers, because obviously, that's a great way to segue onto the wilderness and bushcraft survival topic. So the situation in Alberta is there's areas called Crown Land or public land use zones, and these are fantastic areas that the federal government dedicates to wild camping. And it's very much that there's I think it's an Alberta Hunters Association, and they literally term these zones, they're called PLUS zones, public land use zones. They term these public land use zones the Wild West, because there are very few limits to freedom in sort of the old-timey sort of hunter-gatherer sense, and as long as you're doing things in the right season, you can hunt, you can fish, you can wild camp, you can take four-wheel drive off-road, drag it through the mud, you can...
So, on the hunting front, sorry, just because that caught my ear, is there sort of a quota of what you can and cannot kill, or I'm sure there are some guidelines?
Yeah, so the number one guideline is your hunting season. So you've got your general rifle hunting season, which will be in the fall time generally.
And is that open season? It's kind of a free for all.
So, not in Canada. Not in Canada. What I respect about Canada is, unlike much of the United States, and that's not to say the US has some worthwhile legislation regulating hunting. In Canada, there are competitive hunting clauses that are there to stop people from unfair competition. So let's take the example of the use of helicopters or certain off-road vehicles. A lot of people in the US, and I know this is very popular with hog hunting in Texas, partly because of the overpopulation of hogs there. A lot of people use choppers to basically get airdropped into an area. They will be armed, and then they will go straight to hog hunting, or hunting. Maybe it could be deer or wild turkey, bear, take your pick. You can't do that in much of Canada, certainly not in Alberta, because that creates an unfair advantage to other hunters that may have parked up 10 miles away and trekked into the woods. So open season is it's a loose term, but it's very rarely what people imagine, in the sense that things are highly regulated. You have your cougar, you have your fall cougar season where, you have a prohibited use of dogs. You have certain restrictions on things that may give you an unfair advantage, and this will vary from animal to animal as well.
Okay, so it's quite specific. It goes down to the level of which animals can and cannot be hunted. And does it also go to the amount of animals you can hunt of a particular species? Or
yeah, so you've also got your quota.
Okay.
So let's take, for example, deer, and deer is going to be a very popular game animal in wildlife management units. So areas that are used for hunting, and this could be on prairie land or in the mountains. And I think in a lot of WMUs, you're only allowed to legally shoot 6 deer, and so this could be 3 whitetails and 3 mules. So there's really quite a lot of regulation, not just on the type of animal, but also you've got your quotas, and this is all regulated. And now I'm assuming the Canada uses the US system. Don't quote me on this in terms of doe tags. So you've got to get your doe tags to put on a hunted game animal, just to regulate, how much is hunted, who hunted it, what you are doing with your catch, what you're doing with your hunted game there. So there's a bunch of different regulations, and this is so that fish and wildlife officers and conservation officers can really track and gauge a good understanding of the population. I mean, like the population of deer in the UK, completely out of control because they've got nothing hunting them. Out here,
right, they've got no natural predators, right?
Correct. Out here, there's you've got your cougars, you've got your wolves, bears. So there has to be fairly strict rules on these quota levels, or else you could really cause some harmful imbalances to natural fauna and flora and fauna.
So to take the example, for example, a white-tailed deer, say it's the hunting season and you're going to hunt one wild-tailed deer for personal consumption for you and your family. Is that something that would take a lot of admin, or is it something that's kind of relatively easy to... Is it kind of a case of get your gun, get out there and just declare it once you've captured and killed?
Yeah, so it's fairly... the admin isn't large behind it. You just have to comply with the rules. So you've got to get sort of your permit set up and everything.
Wow, so that could potentially be, if you're comfortable or sort of a person that doesn't have a problem with hunting because you don't see any hypocrisy in it. In fact, it's sort of a healthy understanding of where your food comes from. And I think we'll probably get into that a bit later. But I think it could potentially be a very good and sustainable and cheap way of having a lot of healthy, lean, wild animal meat for you and your family for quite a period of time.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I know someone here in Calgary. They live a little outside of Calgary, and they actually, it's quite crazy. With a compound bow, they actually hunt bear.
Wow!
And that bear meat will feed them for weeks. And feed their family for weeks. I imagine
months.
I'm sure. Yeah. I mean, it depends how big your family is, doesn't it? But he's
how big your freezer is.
Yeah, exactly. And this individual that's doing that, he uses every aspect of the bear.
Yeah.
We're talking the fur, we're talking the offal, and uses that for feeding his dogs as well and things like that. This is actually in an area where the black bear population is completely out of control.
And is there a cost associated with every ant, bear or deer you hunt? Do you have to pay something to the local council / government? Or
so in terms of hunting, it really comes down to, and I'm not sure, I'm not sort of well versed on the exact figures because I've never hunted. But for Canadian residents, there are permits and licenses around the $40 mark for elk, mule deer, white-tailed deer, those kind of things, and it's a bit more.
So is that for the year or per deer?
That would be for the year.
Wow!
But then there's
so next to nothing.
Yeah, it's not a lot of money really. But these vary quite dramatically. I mean, if you're looking at migratory game bird permits or turkeys, it's going to be a bit lower. And then if you're going up towards, goats or bighorn sheep or anything like that, it's going to be a bit higher. And then there's certain fees associated with bow hunting and things like that. And then black bears have different fees associated with them, and which I wouldn't be qualified to talk about. Again, I don't know all the fees and like the individual costs for each animal and all the permits and things like that. And then there's loads of programs that get different kinds of people into hunting at lower costs. So you have like licenses for hunters with disabilities, for senior citizens. There's also different, I'm not sure about hunting, I'd imagine, but fishing for sure differs in cost for First Nations people and Inuits. In fact, I think for Inuit and First Nations hunters, in a lot of areas, fishing is there is no cost associated with it because how closely it's associated with their livelihoods and their day-to-day lives. I mean, let's not forget, a lot of the Inuits, if they survive on trapping, their existence and their trade and commerce survives on trapping and hunting. This isn't a hobby people do once a month with dad. This is life to them. So you could not regulate it in the same way you couldn't rubber stamp that.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm just asking about the nitty-gritty because I suppose that's where maybe some of the interesting detail lies in it, kind of looking at how relatively easy it is to go out there and hunt a wild animal. So obviously there's things like a weapons or gun license. I imagine typically it would be a gun you would use as your weapon of choice. And then going out there, would you have to pre-declare your intention to go and kill a wild animal?
So I don't think you'd have to pre-declare, and again, I don't want to be talking out of my hat here, but you have to have your firearm registered first and foremost. Sure. So this isn't like the US where you can, in some states you don't even have to register a firearm. You have to go through a specific course to acquire the firearm.
It's a bit more stringent, isn't it?
Far more stringent, and the background checks are far more comprehensive in terms of mental health. Which is great, and also they're far.
God, did you pass that?
Well, I haven't filed that yet.
Crazy bastard.
Yeah, crazy bastard. I'll probably get bloody rejected. But they're far more comprehensive and they're far more frequent. So I believe the last time I was watching this on Canadian Parliament, from what I picked up, they run your name basically every day. So they run your name federally with all correctional facilities and mental, which is so couldn't be more different from the US, where you might get that initial background check and then you're done. Here's your gun. So
well, that's insane. Yeah. I mean, in my humble opinion, that's far too easy. But wow. Okay. So if you don't, let's say you don't have to pre-declare, because I think that makes sense. Why? I don't think that's a thing. And then once you've killed the animal, do you then have to declare what you've killed and how much or how many, if you've killed more than one, or is it pretty much not sort of tracked?
So from what I understand, this all comes down to the type of animal. So let's take the example of an antlerless white-tailed deer. License. So this is going to be issued with two tags, and this will be valid for your 2020 or your 2019 season.
2 tags. What does that mean? Does that mean you got 2 deer?
Yeah, hunt, that's right. That's right. And this will mean you're eligible to hunt a couple of deer with that. But again, I don't know each and every animal. This would be something to look up on the Environment and Parks websites, and I wouldn't want to say something wrong for a certain animal, but from what I understand, that it would depend on the animal, it would depend on the season, it would depend on like the population numbers.
Sure, yeah, there's a lot of variables that go into the calculation, I'm sure.
Yeah, it's all fluctuating. Basically, it fluctuates depending on what people
demand and supply.
Demand and supply. How many bears there have been would depend on how many deer there's been. How much, if there's been a wildfire, there might not have been so much deer, there might have been less vegetation, less berries for them to survive off. So, there's all these different things to take into account.
So it is monitored on an ongoing basis, and to keep the ecosystem balanced, I suppose, which is, I suppose, a healthy approach and something I'd expect of the Canadian people.
Yes, the Canadian people are
a measured bunch, or more measured than their American counterpart.
They're a measured bunch, but it's also a country of outdoors people and frontiersmen, and they're very much, they're not a nation of shopkeepers like we are in the UK. So that's a,
and this is what I kind of going to get onto, because in the UK at least, we have a very sort of sanitized distance to the slaughterhouse. We pick up, the minced beef, the pork fillets, or the pork medallions, or whatever, the leg of lamb. We don't really think about, or don't really potentially want to think about, where that meat's come from and what it's been through, what the animal's been through. And I think that's almost a bigger hypocrisy than the same people who will then criticize hunting.
Yeah, I think if someone criticizes hunting but is a complete vegan or vegetarian, I do see more consistency there. But certain people have crossed my path in the UK and they've been very anti-hunting and found it abhorrent, but then they'll be tucking into their gammon or tucking into their tucking into a bit of veal or something like that. And I just think there's such a hypocrisy there, because you're not only eating meat, but you're allowing an industry to profit off, effectively mass slaughtering and hunting as well. So, yeah, my opinion is just sort of pick your, be consistent in your arguments, really.
Right, and I think if you're going to go down that argument saying that hunting's wrong on the grounds of, and I'm not sure what the grounds would be, because I'm certainly one for believing that if you try and divorce yourself from the process or outsource the slaughter process, and then yet you're against hunting, sort of seems, those two views seem at odds for me.
Yeah, there's certainly an inconsistency there that's quite annoying. But I think, like a lot of things, culture is more pervasive than people think. And the culture in the UK is certainly in England is far from outdoorsy, and I'd imagine that the hunting and to a lesser extent the fishing communities are very much dwarfed by those in the US and Canada. And in the UK, I think there's certain taboos around hunting as well, and that probably just comes from sort of a cultural squeamishness around things like wild camping and hunting and fishing. So it's that squeamishness that's very pervasive.
And I think it's almost an unhealthy disconnect between, the cow that's been grazing and living a life, and that sort of sanitized, perfectly packed 500-gram pack of minced meat beef, and you don't really make the connection. But I think hunting probably puts you back in touch with that natural connection that we, for the vast majority of our existence on this planet, has been a feature of our daily life.
Yeah.
And it's funny how quickly we've sanitized that process and become used to this sort of, we're not at the front end of that process, and we're quite happy just to receive our meat in the form of these plastic containers.
Yeah. Well, you've just raised an important point, like the last mile delivery and the plastic containers and all the other environmental threats that come with
the whole supply chain. Yeah.
Absolutely. That comes with just receiving the meat, that is more harmful to the environment in terms of your carbon output than just going hunting. But hunting is a staple aspect of wilderness survival, because at the end of the day, you've got to know your you've got to know your animals. You've got to know what you can eat legally. You've got to know, again, what you can eat safely, and that's more on the plant side, because there's a lot of plants that look painfully similar. One's going to kill you, and the other's going to prolong your existence.
I was just going to say that I think on the animal side, the fauna side, I think it's a lot easier sort of to make a mistake and get away with it, whereas on the flora side, if you make a mistake, it could potentially be your first and last.
Yeah, and we've seen that from, the most obvious example is, your Into the Wild situation. Like the guy wasn't killed by the Kodiak, he was killed by eating, was it the wrong mushrooms or the wrong berries or something like that? I mean, there was
yeah, and there's a lot of berries, blueberry, raspberry lookalikes that look very similar to their edible cousins, but have obviously a very poor effect on the human body, and obviously not a desirable outcome. But yeah, I think this takes sort of an intimate knowledge of which we've obviously lost in large parts. There's probably a very small proportion of the population that can confidently go out and forage right and edible and healthy flora.
Exactly. And actually in the UK, there's a disproportionately high number of flora that can really hurt you or kill you. The UK has a lot of very poisonous species of flora. I mean, the number one rule is don't eat anything unless you know what it is, especially plants. If you can't identify it, do not eat it.
Well, Leo, this is always like almost a thought that's always struck me as a child, was like there must have been a hell of a lot of people that sort of sacrificed themselves to find out that things aren't very edible and potentially lethal, right? And back in our ancestors, and there must have been a lot of experimentation and therefore death and negative outcomes, and therefore sort of a tacit knowledge passed down generations saying, don't ever eat these blackberries because you'll end up like Uncle Ted.
Yeah. Well, that's very true. I think the amount of sacrifice, before mass information would have been huge. And you've got very you've got sort of your deadly nightshade, colloquially deadly nightshade, the belladonna plant.
What is that?
What on earth is that?
That bloody
deadly night. My dad always.
Is it an aubergine?
Can you chop it up and put it on a salad? Sprinkle it on.
Can I make baba ganoush out of it?
It's definitely not good for baba ganoush or anything like that. It's a poisonous sort of. It's a perennial plant, and in its family you've got to
Moussaka.
Sorry, what was that?
Moussaka?
Not quite. No. I mean, it's. I'm afraid not, Andre. It's closely related to your tomatoes and your eggplant. It's native to Europe, North Africa, Western Asia, and you got some distribution in Britain as well. But the foliage and the berries, as tasty as they look, and the sort of purpley color of them, are extremely toxic. And you got all kinds of crazy stuff in those berries and foliage, from hallucinogens to things that cause severe delirium. So you've got to be very careful there. And it's so tempting, if you were stuck out in the wild, to be like, oh, that looks so juicy and tasty, and that's just what I need because I haven't eaten in 2 days. But it's toxicity is crazy.
Yeah, so every time I do chow down on a nice raspberry, I do spare a thought for those. Not every time, obviously, that would be insane. But from time to time, I do sort of think back to the amount of people that had to sort of try things, and it must have been a process of trial and error. How else would you find out that it had adverse effects on Homo sapiens?
Yeah. Well, survival is, it's always a delicate balancing act of foraging and also resting to preserve your energy, burning and consuming calories. So, that balancing act is hard to strike because you've always got the urge to satisfy your burning desire to be full again, and also preserve your energy so that you don't exert too many calories.
Yeah, and I think it's funny how there's certain very poisonous flora that's actually very visually alluring, so very red or with sort of vibrant colours that stand out from the grey foliage. And it's interesting as to why they're so sort of colourful, and maybe it's because they're sort of that bright and coloured to be eaten by animals and then excreted to propagate their species. I think that's probably why. But it just happens that a lot of those sort of vibrant coloured berries are lethal to human beings, or potentially make you very, very sick. Obviously, I think it's the minority of cases where it's absolutely lethal. But to take an example, there's that mushroom that you see across European forests. Gosh, I don't remember what it's called, but you know the one I'm talking about, the sort of the red one with the white dots that you see in all of the children's cartoons and comic books. I don't know what
you're talking about. You know, Toad in Super Mario Land, that kind of.
Yeah, basically.
I know what you mean. Yeah. And is that?
But that for example is just a magical looking mushroom. It just looks incredible, and you know you're almost, you can't help yourself but pick one and see it, and you know if you didn't know better, you might even take a bite.
It just looks like the kind of thing that would make you happy if you ate it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But you raise an excellent point there, Brother Bear. You raise a really good point, because not just plants, but amphibians, marine life, bugs, if something has bright colours, generally that's nature's way of telling you that eating it might kill you. And the classic example is the highly poisonous dart frog, which is a rainforest amphibian. And I think, you know, even contact from your finger to, you know, your eye or your mouth can induce some extremely terrible effects, and you know lead to eventual, you know, failure of your entire system. So you're absolutely right to say that bright colours, don't touch them.
Yeah, but at the same time, you know, funnily enough, the edible stuff is also quite vibrant. So all of your sort of edible berries are quite colourful. I think it's probably by the same token that the poisonous stuff is vibrant, is because it's maybe encouraging animals to eat them and then excrete them and then propagate them further afield. I think that's the evolutionary reason why they're so vibrant.
So you mean in terms of attracting?
Yes.
Yeah. I think.
Or a warning, right? Because when you're talking about fauna and the example of the poisonous dart frog, yeah, I think it is, and a wasp is another sort of more relatable example.
No, you raise a good point there. Sort of the Darwinian aspect of that in terms of, you know, natural selection. I think that, you know, the brighter colours are a warning. You know, you know the nature's equivalent. You know, flashing red and blue lights, or you know, a massive red and white tape around a huge manhole cover. You know, stay away. This will hurt you. So you're absolutely right there. I'd imagine that's an evolutionary trick. And the thing is, you know, flora can be much trickier to identify than fauna. And this is a difficult thing. But, I mean, let's be obvious here for a second. You see a shark, you see a tiger, you see a grizzly, you're going to stay the hell away.
Yeah, that almost triggers, I think, almost an evolutionary deeper reflex.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and this is how our ancestors kept us alive. I mean, the other week I was walking away from anyone, away from my car, and I saw a black bear about 15 meters in the woods. And my heart rate.
Oh wow!
Heart rate started to skyrocket, and then I just carried on, just getting away from it. And even though a lot of black bears are very docile and, you know, pretty chill creatures, to be honest, they just want to get on with their thing. It just takes that 1 in 100 to tear you apart completely.
Wow, I think it's obviously that's where our fight response comes from. Our instinctive fight response comes from, and I think it's funny that in the modern world there's not the same danger or triggers, and the triggers have taken a very different form, and almost that fight response has been repurposed, whether that's work stress to getting to the next deadline, getting that report to your boss, or whatever it may be, a divorce you're going through, I don't know. There's all sorts of sociological structures that we've managed to implement relatively quickly that have repurposed and almost been overlaid with that fight response, which has been there for millions of years.
That's so interesting you bring that up, and I would love to talk a bit later on the line in this podcast with you about the sort of philosophical side of survivalism and the fight and flight response, because now, you know, your fears, your sort of survivalist fears, are not brought on by, have I seen a grizzly? Have I got enough to eat? They're brought on by, did I reach the sales target? On, how's my Salesforce dashboard looking? Did I file those accounts? That's something that hasn't really existed in Homo sapiens for long. It's only been sort of in the past 80 years that this has been a.
Well, I suppose it's an ancient response to a brand new stimulus.
Yeah, I think so. It's a very archaic, very something as old as the wind sort of response, but the stimulus has been completely inverted, right?
Yeah. The stimulus is obviously not the saber-toothed tiger, as every article calls it. Why can't it just be, get off the saber-toothed tiger? Why can't it be a bit anyway? But you know what I mean. It's the trigger has been shifted quite drastically. Obviously, your boss is now the proverbial saber-toothed tiger.
Yeah, you're right. Your boss,
or whatever that may be. Yeah. But about, I just sort of I did a bit of a Jamie on the toadstool mushroom, the red with the white dots.
Yes,
it's called Amanita muscaria, commonly known as the fly agaric or fly amanita mushroom. It's the genus Emerita, and it's in the boreal regions of the northern hemisphere. And just looking at the toxology and the poisonous nature of this mushroom, apparently human death's very rare in the case. You'd have to have around 15 of these mushrooms to get any sort of fatal effects. However, it is highly psychoactive in certain quantities, and these are constituents being the active ingredients that make it psychoactive are ibotenic acid and muscimol. It's very interesting because I heard about this mushroom, and I actually saw a documentary about this guy who lives in the Black Forest of Bavaria. He's almost like this hermit that lives out there, and he cooks these mushrooms up and goes on these wild hallucinogenic trips. But obviously not, he's sort of playing with fire, because not done right it could very easily kill him. But I think visually, they're just going back to the point where it originally came up. They're just very visually alluring, and you can't help but they look like candy. It's insane. It's like something that's dropped out of a Super Mario Bros. Game right into the real world.
Yeah, you sort of feel like the natural equivalent of being, a kid in a confectionery store, and you're just looking in like, I really want to pick that and eat that. But that's really interesting, because I've always wondered, what is that called? What does it do to you? And now I know.
Well, I just remember it had a very profound effect on me, because I, as a child, was walking through a Polish forest and came across a bunch of these. And I just remember just being absolutely taken with their appearance amongst all of this seemingly sort of grey-green, dark green, brown forest. And they just stood out like a sore thumb. And it was just like, wow. You couldn't help but just sit back and admire. And really, as a child, all you want to do is sort of pick it up, touch it, maybe even taste it. Yeah.
It's amazing that, isn't it?
It looks like candy.
It absolutely looks like candy. And it's so interesting that a piece of flora has developed to be so different to those around it. I mean, it's, you could liken that to, a Hell's Angel biker walking into a room full of office suits in New York or London.
Absolutely.
It's that, the contrast is that vivid and strong.
I would say it was that vivid that I would describe it as almost it was shining.
Shining, yeah, I can imagine. Like saying, pick me, screaming, pick me, like some kind of Alice in Wonderland scenario.
They almost have like this waxy substance on the top, which gives them like this almost glistening look as well, as if it's just like freshly laid icing sugar or something.
Kind of a fluorescence.
That glistening look? Yeah, fluorescence, yeah.
No, you're absolutely right. It's a sort of glistening, sort of tasty look to it. I think that's really interesting. I'm glad I know what that is. And the funny thing is, Andre, in most situations, actually, flora is so much trickier to identify than fauna. So there's so many instances where plant species don't look that dissimilar. They look incredibly similar, but one is edible and the other is not. So, for example, when you're out in the bush and you don't have any cell service, yarrow is a perfect example. And yarrow is a flowering plant. has some great medicinal benefits. In fact, in times of COVID, it's something to stock up on because it's it's a herb that's really useful for, you know, fever, common cold. You know, it helps with menstruation, loss of appetite, all those kind of ailments. It's easily mistaken for the highly toxic water hemlock. So if you haven't learned how to distinguish them, you're really playing with fire there. So that's a major example there of how two plant species can look the same but cause extremely different effect.
And what about its global geography? Where are those found typically?
So yarrow, as a plant, it flowers in regions of the northern hemisphere. So it's predominantly found there, and you'll find it in Europe and North America. They do introduce it in areas as feed for livestock.
Okay.
But it can thrive in wet and dry areas. Get it in a lot of meadows, fields, even coastal plains. So it's a common one.
It's so fascinating because I always think to the backstory of how we ever found out that it had these properties. It must have been through trial and error. Surely it's nothing else. And even things like coffee, man, like the process you have to go through to make coffee. I mean, someone, okay, put it this way. Someone had to pick up these berries, okay, the red berries, then take out the seeds, then dry them, okay, then cook them with heat, okay, and then grind them, and then put them in water. Who the hell, like, how many berries and leaves and various flora are there out there that you would have done this with and failed miserably? But no, like, they managed to do it because we've done enough of it that they found that these particular berries, these particular cherries, can be made into a delicious caffeinated drink.
That's really good, man. I've never even thought of it that way. But yeah, just imagine the amount of people that have died. Or the amount...
Just trying to make coffee from, like, some insane, like, devil's trumpet flowers, which we can talk about later.
Exactly. Or just the amount of people that maybe picked coffee beans and tried to eat them and thought, oh, God, that tastes shit. But then it just took one person to maybe 1,000 years later boil them up in water to get the nice caffeinated beverage.
Or even like dietary staples of Africa and South America, like yams. They've apparently, I don't know if it's yams exactly, but it's something very similar to yams, and they contain dangerous amounts of cider unless treated in a very specific prescribed way. And part of that is rinsing them in a stream for a period of days to wash out all of the cyanide, and that's once they've been ground into a pulp. So you put them in a pulp, put them in a cotton bag, let them rinse in the stream for 2 days to wash out all the cyanide, and then you cook them up and can make pancakes at them in the confidence that there's no cyanide left. But how the hell did you, like, how many people died of cyanide poisoning before someone's like, oh yeah, mate, that all we have to do now is rinse them? Then it won't happen.
Exactly, yeah. What is the body count? How many died? Or
for us to enjoy yams today.
Yeah, and that's probably the same for bitter almonds, isn't it? I mean, almonds contain elements of cyanide, don't they? But the process of from like harvest to consumption, takes out the poison. But how many?
Yeah, I had a terrible experience with really fresh almonds. There was a friend of mine, and she gave me fresh almonds, and I don't think, because a lot of the almonds we get in the supermarkets in Western Europe are sort of dried almonds. Okay, and I think there's a difference, because the fresher almonds contain this sort of milk you see almost in a dandelion when you pick it off. And I have a slight allergic reaction to almonds anyway, but I was like, what the hell? It's quite mild anyway, my allergic reaction to almonds, so I'll just try it anyway. I took one almond, and about 2 minutes later my entire top lip was swelling insanely and my throat was constricting.
God.
And this was because it was a fresher almond that hadn't been dried, and the milk was still contained within, and it just created, it was the first time I thought, wow, okay, allergies are really no joke.
Yeah. God, you never told me about that. I didn't know that happened.
I mean, it wasn't sort of ambulance calling. It wasn't pleasant. Obviously my breath was constricted, but I knew I was going to be fine.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't go through it again, and now I know. But yeah, it was a bizarre experience. I mean, I'm mildly allergic to almonds. I think the process of cooking it, so if it's in the cakes and things, I'm fine. And even dry ones, I'll have a mild allergy, so my throat does constrict a little bit, but it's nothing. It's not massively unpleasant, so I'll go through it if I really want almonds. But if the fresh ones were a different beast entirely.
And would you say that was the worst experience of inflammation you've had from nuts?
Definitely. Yeah, it was scary how the lip literally puffed up to sort of 3 times its size. And you know, the throat, it wasn't wheezing, but you could feel I wasn't getting all the air I wanted.
Yeah.
So that wasn't a pleasant experience, but I somehow in my gut knew it was going to pass, and it was just a matter of time. And I've never been someone who's been particularly allergic to food, but there are allergies that sort of come and go.
Yeah.
As you age. It depends. It's a lot of it's with age, and a lot of it's in your genes. But yeah, it's interesting how one food cooked in various forms, like in cakes, I'm fine. Like dried, not great, but it's fine. I can deal with it. And then fresh with that sap still inside, really adverse effect.
God, it's amazing, isn't it? Preparation really is everything. As well. I mean, once you've got to get past the initial hurdle of can I eat it or not, and then the preparation and how it's served up to the person who eats it is everything. And it's interesting because one of the priorities that you have to make when you go to a new area or you're out in the bush trying to survive, it's really good to get schooled on what the indigenous people eat. And really a lot of people just don't have that local knowledge. So one of the best sources to find out about edible plants is what the indigenous people eat in that specific area. And that, you know, in parts of Alberta, it'll be your First Nations people. And, you know, that tacit word of mouth information that was passed down through generations. Don't go near this plant, but you can eat that plant, you know. So
yeah.
That's where you get your preparation knowledge, really.
Well, they're incredibly in touch with their natural environment, and I think it's something that's almost scary how quickly we manage to unsync ourselves from the natural world and almost be very okay with a very sanitized, distanced, divorced relationship with the natural world, which in a way, although sort of going back to those natural roots fills us with horror of hunting and having to gather and all that. And there are obviously a lot of perks and conveniences to having a supermarket. I don't think it hurts to go back to our roots and learn these things, because I think that probably has a deep satisfaction. It must do, because ultimately that's what our purpose was back then. We had a hell of a lot of less responsibilities. We had to find enough food to keep everyone alive. And if you were doing that, you were doing really well.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And whereas now the hunter-gatherer equivalent is, you know, how much did you sell? You know, how much?
6 figures. I sell. How many choppers did you lease last year?
Did you move the inventory or did you not? If the answer is no, you're fired.
I'm pretty good. I made 250K last year. How are you?
It's not about the money. It's not about the money.
Is it about it? No, it's not about the money.
Well, for me,
For me,
it's kind of about the money. You want to punch me in the face, don't you?
Punch me in the face.
Mom, he punched me in the face. Again, sorry for the tangent there, the Step Brothers references, but had to be done.
It has to be done on the regular. In fact, it's encouraged.
But yeah, the knowledge you've got, you know, and you raised a point earlier about hunting and, you know, the being in touch with nature when you've sort of hunted a beast and you've hunted it ethically and well. You know, that's you know, closely locking fingers with, you know, you grow your own food movement, and you know how your food tastes so much better when you grow it in your backyard. And that's not just to do with GMOs, but I think that's because you've developed an emotional and a psychological connection with the land around you.
Yeah, so I think if you're a person who enjoys their bacon sarnie, I think you should
definitely
be more than comfortable to go to a slaughterhouse and watch a pig get killed via electric shock, which is, I think, is the most typical way it's done in Europe.
Yeah.
Failing that, you become vegetarian. Failing that, you're kind of comfortable enough to go and hunt it yourself. And I think if you're unable to at least meet some of those, then you shouldn't really be eating the bacon. Because so. I mean, I think it probably speaks to the growing traction of the vegetarian vegan movement over the last decade. And I applaud it to a large extent, because I think, for one, it's a good thing for climate change, because of the amount of land being used to sustain livestock and the methane. And then for a second, yes, I think a lot of the conditions animals are kept in the Western world included are abhorrent.
Yeah, the environmental aspect is a huge consideration, but I'd say that aspect of the debate is far more clouded. And just because, well, two things come to mind. One, certain animals are overgrazing because their populations are too high, and the hunting and trapping communities actually are doing favors for the environment. Two, there's a huge amount of environmental degradation and certain areas where desertification is even becoming a problem, because the harvesting of tofu is just gone completely. It's completely skyrocketed. But there's certainly, there's certainly huge environmental threats that come from the mass production of meat. But I would say the biggest argument that trumps all is just the treatment of these animals in a factory setting is just horrific.
Yeah, I don't think. I think it's almost a given now, at least from my perspective, that history will not look kindly back on the times and the ways we've looked after livestock.
No,
I think it will be almost looked as badly upon as the concentration camps. Not that bad, but it is in the same ish league. And I think I know that sounds very extreme, but I think it is sort of in getting there, because some of the conditions. I mean, these are animals that can't even stand up, that can't even turn around. Battery hens, one example. Obviously, the EU outlawed that a number of years ago, and that's a good step in the right direction. But there's so much more to be done.
Yep.
And I do try and buy free range when possible. Yeah, there's all sorts of steps you can make. But you're right. I think monoculture of any type, whether that's flora or fauna, it also, the vegan vegetarian movement isn't exactly blameless in this. You've got the soybeans and the monocultures associated with a lot of the Amazon deforestation there, with palm oil and soybeans is, very damaging for the ecosystem. Definitely.
I think it's worrying the amount of vegetation and the carbon sinks that we're losing as a result of this. But you're certainly right. I think we will look back in generations to come when perhaps we have a developed sense of consciousness to how to treat these animals, or perhaps we've got technologies that allow us to make plant-based meat alternatives that are actually efficient or tasty. We will look back at this time as if it was a genocide, really, a constant genocide against animals.
Yeah, I think it would be very much looked upon in that way. Because what it is a mass slaughter, and these animals arguably they're definitely not unconscious. They've got an element of consciousness. I think that you can't argue with that, particularly pigs, cows. They all have feelings to some greater or lesser extent, and I think maybe the world's slowly waking up to that. But I think there is a way of also being a meat eater, but also doing it in harmony with the environment. And maybe hunting, going back to the way it was always done, is one way, a sustainable way of doing it.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, as long as you hunt ethically and responsibly, and you're able to get your accuracy with whatever weapon you're using very, very good prior to you hunting, I think that those are the steps that you should take. Yes, animals, they lack the cognitive aspects we have, like motivation, self-awareness, but they do have feelings, and they are conscious beings. So, you want to hunt ethically as possible, and that's why there's certain rules in place. For example, when bow hunting over here in Canada, or in Alberta at least, you need a 40-pound draw weight at the very least on your bow, because anything less than 40 pounds is going to be a very slow and painful death for the animal. And it's going to...
Is that because it wouldn't penetrate the hide of said animal? Or?
Well, it could be something like that, or it could be that it punctures an organ or something, but just not enough for a quick death. And there's so many cases of people going out there, moronic yahoos, just going out with, a 20 or 30 pound draw weight bow, a recurve, going out hunting an elk, hunting a deer. It gets shot with the arrow, and then it just sort of sadly drudges off, slowly dying. And then in the next few hours, the wolves or the bears or the cougars are going to smell it, and they're going to just eat at it. And it's just a terrible way to get your dinner. Really, it's a terrible way. You're doing it at the maximum expense of the maximum amount of pain caused to your prey, really, and it's a horrible way to go about.
And I can just imagine when you're drawing the bow, there's all those thoughts going through your head, so you have to make a clean kill. And I suppose that's an element of stress and responsibility.
Yeah, there's a huge amount of responsibility behind that, and a lot of people have to emotionally prepare themselves for that. There's a lot of people who would have hunted in the past in First Nations tribes who would bathe in freezing cold water to clean themselves and sharpen their senses to a T before hunting the beast. That's what we would see now as quite an extreme measure, but again, these measures will stem from a greater respect for your prey. So I think there's many ways that you can prepare yourself, because there's so much responsibility if you're going out with a bow or a rifle to hunt.
Yeah, I think the more responsibility you feel, probably that's an indication that you're on the right path in terms of your thinking, and realizing the gravity of what you're about to do.
Yeah,
because to some greater or lesser extent, these are sentient beings, and you want to give them and treat them with the utmost respect. So I think that hunting aspect is quite a healthy one, in that you understand what you're doing. You're there in the process from start to finish, and there's almost like a ceremonial respect given to the animal.
Yeah.
And Leo, do you feel like you're in the headspace, or sort of getting to the headspace where you're ready to go out and do some hunting?
Honestly, if I were to put my hand on heart, I'd say no, not yet. And that would highlight an innate hypocrisy in me right now, because I am a meat eater. So I'd have to ethically and philosophically meditate on that one. And I personally think it's going to take quite a few hours, quite a few months of meditation before I am ready to do that. But
is it something you want to get to, a headspace you want to achieve? Or?
It's something I'm certainly interested in. I mean, I've not reached a final decision on it yet, but there's obviously something in me that wants to do that. And I think a lot of that comes back to just being exposed to a lot of wilderness and wild camping environments, which I have lately. It may be partly out of necessity somewhere down the road. And it's also a natural interest. But it's definitely something that I'm gaining more and more of an interest in, but it's going to take some meditation before I can go ahead with it.
It's really interesting, because funnily enough, it's almost so feasible and within your reach now to do that, and within your power to do that, because you've got your gun license, you've had your training course with the survival thing and first aid and all that, and you're training with your bow and arrow. So it's almost like you've almost reaching and ticking all the prerequisites to going out there and hunting your own animal.
Yeah.
Now, me sitting here in a sanitized room in London, I'm not as close on that trajectory as you are, and so maybe my views will change. But sitting from sort of my high horse here in London, where I'm sort of in a sanitized environment, I'd like to think that I'd go on a similar trajectory to the one you're on, and almost try and push myself to a space of where I'm comfortable with doing that, because I recognize the hypocrisy of eating meat all my life and not being comfortable killing it. Yeah.
It's interesting you put it that way, because it is a journey. I think being...
And you're way ahead of that. It's really interesting for me to hear from you because you're almost scarily close to doing the act. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah. And it's a very frightening journey, and it helps you realize a lot about yourself. It highlights hypocrisies perhaps you weren't aware of, and that's what I'm realizing right now. Things that I'm more squeamish about than I thought, things that I'm more hypocritical about, and it is this sort of journey, it's a psychological journey that you really have to meditate on. And I'd like to think that I'm going to go about it in a responsible way, because at the end of the day, I have this huge respect for animal life. I mean, I assisted... One example is just...
I mean, you work at a zoo now, don't you?
Well, exactly. And the other day, yesterday, I assisted my roommate in rescuing a magpie that had a broken wing.
Wow.
And it was found when out fishing. And we stored the magpie in our bathroom. It shat everywhere, by the way. But that's fine. He actually constructed a cardboard box with air holes. I helped construct the nest, and we stored it in there, and it's now with the vet, either going to be helped or sadly put down because it might never fly again. So, I just have this love for animal life, and I think I would want to know sort of psychologically if I was ready before hunting, but also I would really want to gain an understanding from the ranger's office and from fish and wildlife officers, and law enforcement, which I would definitely give a phone call to. How big is the deer population in this area? How does that fit into the puzzle of bears and cougars and vegetation? How much of an impact will I have on the flora and fauna if I hunt, say, 2 deers this season? I would want to know, because at the end of the day, I'm constantly at this battle where I'm thinking I want to minimize my impact, my negative impact, that would be, on the flora and fauna in the natural environment. And if I can hunt and have a positive impact, which I know is something that many hunters, thousands of hunters, pull off every year, whether it's wild hog or black bear, I would be much more comfortable with going ahead with that.
Yeah, this is what we talked about previously with the whole prerequisites and sort of your quota for the season, and what's allowed, what's not allowed, and it's sort of, you've got to put it in the hands of the good county and council of Alberta, and in their capable hands, they'll tell you what is and isn't sustainable from a hunting perspective. It's really interesting, but I almost envy the journey you're on. It's very interesting, and I'm sure it's asking a lot of introspection of you, and it would certainly raise a lot of questions, because although, like I said, I'm sitting from a very sort of privileged position in that, and a sanitized place, and I'm not that close to, or even close to, going out there and hunting something, but you've almost met, I'd say, 80% of the prerequisites, and it's quite an awesome responsibility.
It's a lot, and it's quite emotionally stressful as well, because if it's something that you haven't grown up with, you're going to have this moral dilemma. Some kids, you could have your military brats or kids that are just from hunter and trapper backgrounds, and since they were 5 years old, mum or dad took them out to hunt whitetail every hunting season. And it's a very, I think for a lot of kids that grew up in that environment, it's not much of a journey at all. It's just what in those developmental stages. But for someone who grew up in Milton Keynes, Milton, mate, home of Red Bull Racing, mate. For someone who grew up in MK, it's a million miles away from that. So I think a journey is the right way to put it. It's a psychological, for some people even a spiritual journey, as cheesy as that sounds, from being a city boy to actually learning how to hunt ethically and responsibly.
And is that a space you want to get to, or a state you want to achieve, or is it sort of, we'll see where we go with this? I
think we'll see where we go. I mean, it's something I'd like to achieve. and I'm on as you were saying, achieving those prerequisites. But it's going to take a lot of meditation. I think it's going to take a lot of meditation before I'll be there, and it's also going to take a lot of concrete knowledge from the rangers and the Fish and Wildlife Service in my local area. So it's gonna.
My instinct tells me that's definitely the right approach. You don't want to rush into anything like this. It's I'm sure the first whatever the hunt, if you do end up doing it, has a profound effect on anyone that does it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if someone's not grown up with that as second nature, hunting is going to affect you, and it might not affect you for a few years down the line,
right?
But it is going to affect you.
And your reaction in the immediate, whether that's in the kill successful, you don't know how you're going to react in the given moment.
No.
You can't predict that, really. And I think either way it's going to be an extreme reaction, but you just don't know whether it's going to be sort of joyous, over the moon, a kind of almost a deep satisfaction like you've never felt before, going back to your hunter-gatherer years, generations ago, or is it going to be a moment of a pang of regret and, oh my God, what have I done? And honestly, as much as you meditate, I don't think you'll actually know until you've done it.
No, that's very, very true. You raise a brilliant point there, is that what I will lack from meditation and information is the empirical aspect. And there's no way that anyone can make a judgment call on the empirical aspect until they pull the trigger, or they let go of that bow, let go of the bowstring. And I think you make me think of target panic, and a lot of archers suffer from target panic anyway, which quite comically Ted Nugent refers to as erectile dysfunction for people who practice archery. But target panic is it's amplified when you're actually hunting for real. Which, for those who don't know what target panic is, it's that feeling of sudden distress when you pull back the bowstring to the point at which you completely fail at your shot, and you may drop the arrow, and it's caused by sort of the anxiety built up behind making an incorrect judgment call on your release.
Maybe it's the subconscious wanting you to miss, because you kind of don't want to know what's on the other side of that door when you do kill.
That's a very good way of putting it. I'm 100% it's the subconscious giving you some signals, and it probably is that lack of for the beginning anyway, lack of knowledge of how you feel after you've hunted a deer or a wild turkey or something.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So I think we've talked a lot about the sustenance side of things in terms of one of the key tenets of survival. I suppose the others, speaking sort of from Baloo, the Jungle Book, he talks about the bare necessities of life. What are the others? Like, I suppose fire and shelter's another one, right?
Yeah, so I think moving away from sort of your hunting and trapping sort of elements and more towards technical survival. I wanted to really expand on the sort of the basic 10 essentials that you should be going out with. And this again, so a little disclaimer I want to add before I start on all this is, number one, I don't want to again profess to be an expert. I don't even know what a true wilderness survival expert would look like. I mean, other than a few people that personify that, there's so much discretion and so many ways of doing things. There's often no best practice. So the way I look at it with wilderness and bushcraft survival, on one hand you have science, and when I talk about science, I mean don't give someone with angina in the wilderness nitroglycerin if they take Viagra, because it's going to kill them. Those drugs are definitely locking horns. But there's science on one hand, which is very binary, it's a yes or no thing, but then there's preference. So one guy will tell you how to make the most efficient super shelter, and that might look very different from someone else, and they both work well in different ways. But what I will do, Brother Bear, is talk about the 10 essentials. So really your 10 essentials that you're going to be looking at to have by your side. are, number one, a knife or multi-tool. So this should include a locking blade, a corkscrew, a small saw, tweezers, things like that. Number two, fire-making supplies. And we're going to get onto that later because there's so much discretion on that. Some people talk about fire lighters. Other people can start fire with their bare hands. Third one is a whistle. You want one that's shrill. You want it to work in cold, wet conditions. You want it to penetrate upwind through a storm. So there's some great like Fox 40.
And is that almost as a deterrent or attracting sort of help, or is it potentially for all of the above?
Sorry, so to specify, that is sort of an all of the above. Number one you're looking at with a whistle is your 3 blasts that will denote to people nearby that they need to send out a search party. And you can get very sophisticated whistles, for example, the Fox 40 style. They're available on Amazon. And they're incredibly good for going long distance.
Really? How far can it travel, the sound?
Fox 40. Now you're testing me, Brother Bear. I'm not sure on the exact.
But miles,
distance.
right, rather than meters.
Let's take a little look. I'm going to do a little Jamie here and Google this.
Do it, Jamie. I imagine it would be miles as opposed to meters.
I bloody hope so.
Because if I didn't realise that you had different grades of whistle.
Oh yeah,
it's fascinating. Because I sort of thought, a whistle's like the thing you get in a party bang.
Yeah. So I mean, Fox 40 is a very good brand. They'll exceed 100 decibels.
Wow.
Yeah. So they're going to reach a long distance. And what we did is when I was on my wilderness first aid course, it wasn't by any measure a windy day, but I was a good, I was probably about 800 yards to 1,000 yards away from my search party, and I heard the whistleblower. I heard the whistleblower as if it was just, I'd say, about 10 meters away.
Wow!
So
that's incredible.
That gives you an idea on the distance there. But what's great about the Fox 40 brand is that it's going to penetrate upwind. So you're out in an alpine region or a subalpine region even, and you've got a storm headed your way, and it will penetrate through that storm. So that's your number 3 there, your whistle. Your navigation aids, a very good quality compass, map of the area. Do not take the internet for granted. Some people go around with what's called a dot device, and this is a really useful device if you have no internet connection or coverage. Very, very useful. Actually, sorry, it's called a spot.
And what does that utilize? A GPS network?
So it's going to use its satellite messenger. It's going to use the Global Star satellite network, which is a very low Earth orbit. Sorry, it's not called the dot. It's called a spot satellite messenger. And basically, what it does is alerts the authorities SNR in your area. And this isn't, like dialing 911, 999. This is using low Earth orbit satellites to tell the Ranger's office, and they tell SNR, and they'll tell law enforcement. So spots, I think the subscription's about $30 a year, and it's a great little device to take with you if you're doing backcountry hiking or camping. Again, you've got sort of your common sense with these 10 essentials. You want your sun protection, sunglasses, hat. You want your basic first aid kit. It's complete and unexpired, sized for the adventure you're going on. Number 7, again, this I'm reeling off. These are variations, but I'm reeling these off what I've learned from the Canadian Red Cross. Number 7, you're looking at emergency food and water. There's a formula that escapes me right now, but I think the formula is, 1 day extra for every 3 days camping, 3 day extra for every 7 days camping.
Okay.
And then you're also looking at, your emergency clothing. Number 9 would be a light, whether that's flashlight or headlamp. I go for US police force or military light with some good lumens on it. And then number 10 is your shelter and all the kits and fabrics that you'll need to make your shelter. But if If you're going in boreal and you're in the winter, bring a mylar blanket with a paracord, because you're going to want something heat retentive and reflective.
Wow, so it's interesting how some of those sort of quite high level, like the last one you mentioned, shelter's almost a separate category in and of itself, but then a whistle deserves its own category, which I wouldn't even consider it deserves its own category, but apparently it does. It's really interesting, and it obviously shows the relative importance, because obviously these lists have been tried and tested, and over the years, this is the sort of 10 essentials you need to be having on your checklist before going out there.
Yes, yeah, exactly. These are sort of tried and tested 10 things that will be most useful. And, as I said before, this is really up to discretion. I mean, I think it's the US Air Force for S&R people. They send people out into like Montana and Idaho just armed with a knife and say survive for 10 days. So this is very much, best practice, but there's a lot of discretion. I think it's always good with survivor to remember the rule of 3. So if you're lost out in the bush at night, you're looking to build 3 fires in the triangle. Day or night, you want to send 3 gunshots to alert, search, and rescue. So
is that if you're lost? Obviously, you don't want to be doing that if you're just having...
No. If you do it just if you're not lost, you might get a heavy bill from Fish and Wildlife.
I was just wondering, like, it's just this Canadian tradition. Like, if you are camping, it's good practice to send up 3 shots, even if you're toasting marshmallows and having a great time.
In fact, send up 3 flares, even if you're,
It's best practice to do a shotgun in the air and followed by 3 flares. And that lets everyone know nothing's going on, everything's fine.
I just wanted people to know I'm here, I'm fine, but just to know I'm here. But no, don't do that if you, again, the legality absolution again. Don't do that if you're absolutely fine and not lost. But the rule of 3 is that, and then you've got your 3 whistle blasts as well, that will alert people. But coming back to what you just said about shelters, shelters are a whole category on their own, and there's so much out there just on shelters alone.
Yeah, I can imagine. Best practice on something like material, probably grade of material, grade of the tent.
Yeah. Or depending on the materials you have, what you want, how long you want to survive for. There's so many resources online and in books about what makes a brilliant survival shelter. Given the fact that we have limited time, I'm going to focus on 2 shelters. Both of them are extremely basic. Both of them are useful for worst case scenarios. One in the summer, the other in the winter. So the first one really I would want to talk about is your diamond tarp. And this is your most basic shelter. It's going to be sort of a summer, more appropriate for summer wilderness survival when you're lost in the bush. But what you really need is, all you really need is sort of a 10 by 10 or a 10 by 16 of tarp. You also will need, if that's for the actual shelter, you'll need some paracord or a bit of rope, and ideally some pegs, or you could even use stones. So all you need to do, and this is, some people call it the square tarp. I prefer the diamond tarp, but it's essentially the same mechanism. You're looking to tie one corner of the tarpaulin to a tree, or it could, if there's no trees around, you could do it on a hiking pole or something that's elevated off the ground, and then the other 3 corners you're going to just hold down on the ground, and this will give you enough space to lie down and breathe, but it will protect you from the elements, and protect you from any sort of rainfall and heavy, very intense sunlight, and wind rushes, but that's pretty much the diamond tarp in a nutshell. And if you type in diamond tarp shelters, there's 1,000 videos on YouTube on how to make one, and I advise anyone to look it up. It's really interesting. The cost is very low to make one, but it could save your life.
I love the simplicity or the sound of how simple that one would be to set up, because you just need 3 points of contact on the ground, one on an elevated side. But I suppose then you've got one side exposed at all times, haven't you? You've almost got like this. You're almost, if you are in a bad situation or the weather's not great, you're huddled up in that one corner, aren't you? But at least you're protected in that corner, and you'd want to probably put that corner downwind, or upwind rather.
Yes.
So that you're almost shielded from the worst of it, whether that's rain or snow.
Yeah, exactly, and you can use your common sense to know which way the snow is coming from, or the wind or rain or whatever it may be. But yeah, I
love the simplicity of that one, but I also just like going back to the 10 points briefly.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was because you did mention like the multi-tool, so like the Swiss Army knife equivalent. What about something to make use of the local resources, namely wood, for creating a fire? Sure, you'd need a small or a slightly more substantial knife or an axe potentially to take dead wood down and create a substantial enough fire to keep you going through the night.
Yeah, so again, axes are pretty heavy, and there's some amazing axe brands, ones that pride themselves in being sort of a one-strike cut tool. Some people prefer using machetes to cut wood. I think it's a bit more labor-intensive, but, different people have preferences. I think when we're talking about survival, one of your main aspirations is to get your weight down, because like anything, the more weight you have, the more energy you're going to burn. If you don't have food, that means the quicker you're going to die, the more water you're going to get through. So axes would not be an essential tool, and the reason they wouldn't is because you have so many other means to acquire wood. Dead wood can be found through foraging. You can snap wood with your bare hands. Most boreal forests, which is what I'm used to, are littered with dead wood that's been sort of collected at the base of trees from the past 100 years. So so by that token, it's sort of an axe is a nice to have, but by no means an essential. It's a nice to have. It's definitely not an essential, and eventually it will be a liability, because if you do find yourself 30 miles out into the woods and the mountains with a broken ankle, you got to shed the weight. You've got to shed the weight, or you're going to get through water like nobody's business. So it would definitely not be an essential. It would be a nice to have, and it'd be something you potentially have to just leave behind if you were trying to get back to base camp or trailhead or police or whatever it may be.
Right, understood. Okay. Because is also a fire at night a nice to have, or is it seen as an essential? Which of those baskets does it fall into?
Great question. I'm so glad you brought up fire as well. Because
I suppose it can be one of two things. One, it could be obviously for cooking, boiling up water or melt snow to have drinking water, or two, as a deterrent for any wild animals.
Great, and it's awesome that you know that as well, because a lot of people don't know that it's a deterrent. So fires are definitely an essential. Obviously warmth, food, cleaning water, repelling insects, predators from rattlesnakes to bears, signaling, as we discussed before. You can even, I've never done this. Some people know how to do this. You can even use flame to disinfect a wound. But a fire is an essential for obviously cleaning food and water, getting rid of parasites, but it's also essential in the minuses in temperature when you're building a super shelter. And actually, the fire, I really want to talk about the second shelter here, which is called the basic super shelter, also known as a Halton Hacienda. And this is actually has a symbiotic relationship with a fire to be burning all night. And what I mean by that is the Halton Hacienda, or the super shelter, again, very basic. It uses greenhouse and igloo technology to warm somebody and keep them warm throughout the night. So I'll tell you how it's made. And you're going to need a fire burning next to it constantly. You're going to need about 10 by 16 in feet of transparent or semi-transparent plastic. You are going to need about 10 by 10 of nylon. Or you can buy a lot of nylon for very cheap off eBay or at used stores, Facebook Marketplace. And this stuff, if you can get the old World War II parachute nylon, even better. And that's very readily available just because how much they used to make of it back in the day. So you want 10 by 10 of that, and then you want your Mylar blanket, which we discussed is on the 10 essentials list. So what you do is you're going to make a ridge line from tree to tree. Ridge line with a rope, that is.
Perfectly parallel with the ground and horizontal, yeah?
Parallel with the ground, horizontal about, 5 feet high. Then you're going to put your Mylar blanket over that, and then you're going to put your nylon over that, and then you're going to put your plastic over that. And what will happen is,
so 3 layers.
3 layers,
ideally.
And just again another footnote here. This is really important because it sounds like a lot. It really isn't, and it's going to weigh less than a pound.
Wow.
Yeah, it's going to weigh less than a pound. So or for new money, it's going to weigh about half a kilo. So these are very light things. Nylon can be pretty light. Your Mylar blanket weighs next to nothing. If you develop hypothermia, this is the go-to. So you put those 3 layers on top of each other, and at this point it's made sort of an A-frame, an apex frame. And one side of that A-frame over your ridgeline is letting in infrared light and warmth radiation from your fire.
Mm-hmm. And where are you in all this, by the way? So the fire, where should that be placed relative to this sort of teepee or tent-shaped triangle you've created? Because it's open at either end, right? The way I'm picturing it.
So the fire's going to be 1 meter away. It's an apex at one side. It's going to be opaque because you've got your nylon, your plastics on top of the nylon, and then your Mylar blanket, very important. The other side is going to be transparent, so the fire is going to go through the plastic light. Sorry, the plastic cover. It will penetrate through that, through the form of light and heat energy. It will hit the Mylar blanket, which is on the interior, and then that heat will reflect onto you.
So it almost creates like this micro greenhouse effect.
Correct. And there's an Koresh. And there's an amazing video with a couple of survival experts on YouTube about this, and it shows how temperatures they're in negative 30 or negative 35, and the interior of the tent is at positive 12.
Okay, so Leo, the way I'm imagining it is almost like, so half of this perfect triangle, is it, if we're looking at 5 feet off the ground, it's roughly equilateral. It's got the different material, the almost opaque material at one end. That's the end that fires at as well, and the heat almost travels in one direction. And do you have either end of that, I suppose, triangle open?
You can open the plastic side, or you can keep it closed. A lot of people will keep it closed for extra heat. It will go through the light. The heat will go through the plastic.
Right. So there's no, and also, what about the smoke? Does that become an issue?
It can become an issue, but that's why you'll keep the plastic closed.
Okay.
And it's just this beautiful piece of simple technology. I mean, all you need to understand this, for anyone to understand this, would be a high school education in science. And it makes perfect sense that, infrared radiation travels through a transparent surface. It hits the Mylar blanket, which is incredibly reflective. And just countless people who've had hypothermia have been saved by this Halton Hacienda. But if you type Halton Hacienda into YouTube, it will show you how it looks, and I kind of wish I could draw a diagram, but it's just a wonderful piece of technology.
That sounds beautifully simple, and I suppose that token, it's been a saviour for so many people because it's probably quite easy to erect. And in terms of the fire itself, Leo, because obviously starting with nothing but what's around you in the natural environment, it's not easy, particularly if it's a soggy autumn evening in Alberta.
Yeah, so fires can be tricky to make when you're dealing with very cold and rainy conditions. I mean, I think one place that's good to start is having a pack of firelighters with you. Obviously, if you don't have that, you're going to be looking at, for survival, tearing off a piece of your shirt or a piece of clothing that you can light up. Once you light that cotton, that should provide substantial fire to keep you, to basically light some tinder. Once your tinder goes up, you've got your logs that will go up after that. So you want to be looking at lighting a bit of cotton, putting that in a closed area. It could be a tin, or it could be a dry patch under a tree, and just sort of really caring for your initial spark as if it's, you know, your firstborn child. just blowing at it, and you know, making sure that you even if you have 100 matches, act like you only have 3.
Right.
You know, so just really caring for that initial flame, and then making sure that you prepare. You've got the tinder ready. You've got your dry leaves ready. If you don't have dry leaves, use slightly damp leaves, but make sure that you get that cotton lit up. And even if that takes 20 minutes or half an hour, just got to really care for that initial flame.
Right, must just nurture it, like you said. And I mean, there's a lot of amazing, ingenious modern ways of creating a spark. I remember Bear Grylls was selling these fantastic sort of 2 flint sticks, which you sort of flash or scrape across each other at speed, and then it generates quite a substantial spark or sparks. And you can then light sort of your kindling or your cotton or whatever you may have to hand. Is that something you have or want to get, or how just but like kind of where you are now in terms of your understanding, what do you have or want to get, or kind of would be your go-to to create a fire out there?
Yeah, so I mean, I've got a range of things. I've always got my matches and a lighter with me, and I'll always carry some fire starters, you know, which a lot of people are familiar with, you know, from the barbecuing world. And those will generally go up if you're careful with them and shelter them, rain or shine. But I always like to carry my rod and striker with me, just so that I'm able to...
Yes, the rod and striker, that's the term.
The rod and striker is great, because if you know how to use a rod and striker, which I recommend for anyone, you are going to be able to light a fire with your bare hands, really. And we're talking, you know, no flame, no initial match flame, or no sort of artificial burner, no lighter fluid, which you shouldn't really use anyway for wildfire purposes. And I think it's just such, coming back to a little bit kind of how we were talking about hunting and growing your own food, just lighting a fire on your own with your bare hands is an absolutely beautiful and eye-opening experience. And I think if you ask most people in their 20s, male or female, if they could do that, the answer would be no.
Yeah, I remember the magic of starting a fire as a child, and I did it more in Poland than anywhere here, because the UK even back then was too health and safety oriented for you to start a fire. But even then we did put it sort of in a nice little clay pot, had it all contained, and there is a magic to starting your own fire, and almost a primordial fascination. And just it's very hypnotizing once you get it going. You do tend to it like a child, and you know, feed it the bits of kindling, and later the bigger logs, until it roars into a beautiful, self-sustaining, mature fire. And once you get the big logs on, it's quite amazing to watch, isn't it? And sit back in it, because it's such a provider. It's what cooks you food, it's what keeps you warm.
Yeah.
And I think there is definitely that ancestral connection to the civilization that fire brings.
Yeah. Oh, 100%. I think the metaphor of nurturing it like a child is so fitting, because it really does start off just, like a tiny little spark. And then 2 hours later, you've got this roaring log fire that's giving you warmth, and it's giving you food. It's cleaning the water that you're about to drink. And, if you're out camping and it's -30 and, cold water gets thrown in the air, it freezes in the air, that fire is your source of survival.
It's the ultimate provider and the ultimate destructor.
Fight fire with fire. No, you're right.
There is something so fundamental about fire, and I think even now I always have that childlike fascination about starting a fire, and you almost just sit there, and it's all absorbing, your attention is completely taken, well, at least for me, with a fire, and I can just sit and watch it build, and it's almost like an excitement and a seriousness and a purposefulness comes out of just making a fire.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. There's such a sense of purpose that comes out of it, and I think it's just beautiful. I mean, on completely aesthetically, it's beautiful to watch the flames sort of lick the wood, and just see how the wood sort of contorts and changes through the night as different forms of combustion happen.
It's the best entertainment out there.
Oh, yeah. It is. But I would like to talk about the opposite element, water, now.
Water.
Water, low.
Watership.
Watership down. And water is obviously, the elixir of life, and it's so interesting just understanding different ways of cleaning water and accessing water, and there's different ways of doing this. I mean, a lot of people do it through boiling water, which again symbiotically shows you how important, how sort of symbiotic water and fire are for survival. But there's a lot of different ways, and in Alberta we're very lucky, because if those that live near the mountains anyway, like I do, have the fast moving water variant, which it generally has a low parasite count, a low bacteria count, and it's always good to clean though, of course. So your standard, you could boil it for 7 minutes. But there's so many different things you can acquire to help you survive. So you can purchase iodine tablets, or you can purchase some kind of device that allows you to. I know the most popular is the Life Straw, which costs sort of $20 or $30 on Amazon. It removes most waterborne parasites and the microplastics and the bacteria. But I believe the Life Straw doesn't fully remove all viruses. So what you'd want to do if you're really serious and have a lot of money is purchase the Guardian, which is actually the testing standard used by the US military. It kind of resembles a flask that you take to work. It's self-cleaning. It removes viruses, bacteria, Giardia lamblia, which is one of the most common parasites. And it really takes away everything, even sediment, from worst case water conditions.
Well, that's really impressive. And is that over and above? Would it do a lot more than boiling does? Would boiling kill all virus and bacteria within the water?
So boiling kills a lot. Certainly some viruses, the viral load may remain.
Really?
It may kill a lot of viruses, but some can withstand. You've also got the issue with boiling is that it doesn't actually remove dirt. So water can be free from viruses and bacteria and parasites, but it can still be dirty, if that makes sense. So it can still have...
Can you get one of those almost like coffee filter things then, sort of, before you pour it into your flask? Or...
Actually, you're really on the right tracks there. Really basic, sort of common sense methods like that will get rid of a lot of sediment. So you can do things like that. There's other things as well, like kind of unorthodox things you can do if you're really in a tight spot. If you're a fisherman or fisherwoman, you like to fish, but obviously you can't drink salt water, or you don't have the means to clean. You don't have the means to clean river water, fresh water. You can actually drink the spinal fluid of fish. So,
oh god,
yeah, I know it.
That sounds proper Bear Grylls.
It is. It really is. And I think, again, come back to hunting and fishing. If you hunt or fish, you better use every aspect of that animal as much as you can. So again, spinal fluid of fish, of saltwater fish, is safe to drink. And that can get you through another day or two, which could be that day or two that the search and rescue come.
Right, that can make all the difference. Yeah, and I suppose with melting things like snow and ice, if you melt that, because that's rainwater essentially, is that good enough if you melt the water? Because obviously eating snow isn't ideal because that lowers your core temperature. But if you melt it, is it relatively pure then?
Relatively so, yeah. So snow and ice snow especially is really good. It's sort of untouched, untampered with. You get a good clump of that. Make sure you boil it up. That's actually quite a good bet. So again, on water, snow is your friend in terms of drinking for life saving. But again, there are different devices. You can use your I usually carry water purification tablets for river water.
Oh yeah, I was going to ask you about those, because obviously we spoke about the straw, the container used by the Canadian military or the US military grade stuff, which is slightly more on the more expensive side of the scale. But the water purification tablets, how do those work? So you'd boil it and then throw a tablet in, and that would do it for you, or is that chlorinated then, or?
Yeah, so there's different chemicals that are in the tablets. Some use chlorine, some use iodine. They vary on where you get them. I know UNICEF has a massive purification airdrop scheme that it does to distribute to people without clean water in the developing world. But you can buy them in bulk from, Bass Pro Shops, Cabela's, Canadian Tire, all these sort of outdoorsy stores. And they will treat the water for bacteria and some viruses. Again, emphasis on some viruses, because viruses are bastards, but they will generally purify. But again, you want to be looking for fast-moving river water. The nearer the base of a hill or mountain, the better. And then you drop.
So closer to source, closer to base at the bottom.
Closer to source, higher up the mountain, the better. Because it's
less likely got it. Because it's had less time to travel over.
Yeah,
all sorts of rubbish.
Exactly. So
and less tributaries, I suppose. Therefore, less foreign elements.
Yes, exactly, and less potential for stagnation. But you can buy 100 pack of Aquatabs from Amazon, very cheap. Within 30 minutes after mixing, you're going to have an extra added level of purification. Some of them are iodine free because people don't like the iodine, and there's so many different variants. Some are even bloody flavored. Right. I mean, it's there's all different variants that people use, and they're very light. So there's no reason why you shouldn't take them if you're going backcountry hiking or camping.
And I suppose like river water or melted snow is not always going to taste very good. So I suppose you can always bring things like tea bags to flavour it or make it more palatable. But Leo, I just wondered the importance of, because sort of having watched a few survival programs kind of on Discovery here and there, and just reading up on stuff and just general knowledge I've gathered over the years, I heard the importance of keeping things dry come rain or shine is really important, because I suppose if anything of your kit gets damp, especially if it's your clothes or your tent, it can lead to like a vicious cycle which can ultimately end in hypothermia. So is that a very core or important piece of survival, to keep as much of your kit dry as possible?
Yeah, I would definitely say so. I mean, that's a core tenet that you would want to have in the back of your mind when you spend time outdoors, when you're backcountry camping or hiking. I think water can lead to all manner of ailments, from trench foot to hypothermia, to respiratory illnesses. I think that it's a mood killer as well, when things are all wet and damp, and it's just much harder to enjoy yourself in terms of recreation. So I think you're absolutely right. Know your knots, know your fabrics you will need to keep things dry. And I'd say one of the big rules or tenets of survivalism is the more you know, the less you carry.
Right.
So coming back to our US Air Force, sending out people into the Montana bush with nothing but a small pocket knife. The more you know, the less you carry. I think in the interest of keeping things dry, you want to be able to bundle things together well, you want to cover things, and you want to secure them with good rope. And I really, really want to talk about what I like to call the magic string, which is paracord 550.
Nylon.
Exactly, my friend. Nylon. So
A wonder material.
Wonder material. For those who don't know out there, true paracord has a nylon sheath with lots of different inner strands inside. So you can even take it apart and make more sheaths with it. Cords with it. But the design of paracord is so cheap. It has a superior strength to weight ratio. And even though the cordage is thin and light, it has so many uses. I mean, we're talking about, we talked about ridges on primitive shelters before. It can be used for that. It can be used for trapping, bare hands. It can be used for your diamond tarp. A lot of people use paracord for a sort of perimeter alert system. So they make a perimeter alert around their camp, so they'll know when the cougars are in or when an unwanted individual is in. You can use paracord for tourniquets, for blood clots, booby traps, pulley systems. Tying things together, keeping them dry, creating a chain of people on a trail. You can use it.
Wow.
Yeah, there's so many uses for that. You can even use it. I have a friend who uses it as a ramrod on his ramrod alternative for his firearm. So,
okay, Leah.
Yeah.
That sounds like an incredibly dexterous bit of kit you'd always want in there. Backpack. And I suppose my question is, yes, there's a multitude of uses for it. I feel like all of these uses almost have a sweet spot in terms of the length of the said cord. So what cord would you take? Would you take an insane 50-meter reel and then cut off bits as and when needed? Or would you have multiple lengths for all of the purposes mentioned above?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, there's no right or wrong when it comes to length. I mean, I would probably want to think of the thing that would require the most length and then go from there and move down from there. So the largest length would be your perimeter alert system. And if that's going to be, say, 30 meters, take 30 meters. But you might want to take an excess of 5 meters to use for, say, splints or something like that.
Yeah, I suppose you want to think about what you're going to be using it for ahead of time, and obviously you do that. But it's just interesting to think about these very specific questions, isn't it? Because every bit of cord taken that's not used was weight that you didn't need to take. Or space, right? Maybe in the case of nylon cord, because it's not very heavy, but it's just, I suppose, like you said, doing as much as possible and everything you need to do with minimum amount of baggage.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Like if you can take something that way less, go for that, and really think about different scenarios where you might need it, and also get a good understanding of knots as well. I mean, my favorite is, well, a lot of people call it the arbor knot. Here we call it the Canadian jam knot, but it's a great knot. So it's sort of based on like a noose type knot. So pulling it will tighten it, but it's incredibly useful. And there's so many other knots I could reel off, from like a clove hitch to a trucker's hitch, that have various uses for various specific situations.
What was the one you just mentioned in the first on that list?
So the Canadian jam knot, yeah.
The jam knot. Is that by any chance one, just sort of a shot in the dark here, but one where you sort of have the two bits of cord together sort of in parallel, and you come back to the loop, and the loop almost is the bit you pull it on, and then you almost double back through that loop with the two bits of cord, and it's sort of there's almost no way that's going to come undone, because it's looped back through the loop that you've generated at the end or the apex of that cord. I know it's hard to describe without sort of being here physically or speaking to you, but
yeah, it is by the way you're describing it. I'd say that's the one, because you do make a large loop and double back on that.
Yeah, and then sort of the tightening hole is whatever you want to fasten it to.
Yeah, exactly, and it's very adaptable in terms of size. That's a very common knot. It's really good to know that one.
It's an easy one, isn't it, as well? But it's so like you say, strong, and in the worst circumstances, rain or shine, it's something you can, if you need to erect a shelter, is probably the one you might go for.
Yeah, definitely. It's an easy one that you'd use when you make, say, a ridgeline, and then there's other knots that would really come in use in other situations. For example, a double fisherman's knot ties two bits of rope together. Say you've had to sever some rope to use for, I don't know, a tourniquet for someone's leg. You can then reattach those knots together, those ropes together, if you know the double fisherman's.
So were these all knots you were taught on that 2-day training course?
No, it was a couple of them. And that was just because we had a few Scout veterans and Eagle Scouts on the course. But generally, no, these are from online and from a book, a really good book, which is called 100 Best Knots. I know another one from working in landscaping, the Trucker's Hitch, and that's a brilliant load securing knot. Again, if you really want to bundle something together so that it doesn't get wet, which I know you're asking about before, the Trucker's Hitch is an excellent knot to know.
I think people are going to be looking more towards generally learning about these skills, because one, they carry sort of, because they relate so closely to your day-to-day survival, creates a very meaningful, I suppose, narrative when you're out there in the wilderness. And I think people generally, there's a trend towards people getting back in touch with nature and getting back in touch with, I suppose, what 99% of their ancestors went through. And because I think there is almost a genetic innate sense of purpose that comes or stems from that. Yeah,
I think there's such a inner peace, and you really feel like you're achieving your true north compass when you feel that inner purpose. There's almost no anxiety that I should be doing something other than what I am doing right now when you're out there surviving, because by definition it's survival, and it's all engaging, and it's you're 100% there. You're not sort of drifting and thinking about other things. You're 100% there and present and focused on surviving and getting this fire going and cooking your food and then getting enough sleep. And it's kind of all survival, I suppose, is innately gives you a here and now purpose, and there is nothing else beyond that. It doesn't give you almost a headspace to think about what if I should be going into marketing or not. yeah that's such a great way to put it. It's so it's so binary. There isn't a choice, and we're so used to all these choices of things, what to consume, where to work, who to associate with. None of that comes into none of that comes into your mind when you're pulling your arrow back. None of that
in a weird way, like survival, like relieves you of the burden of those choices.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it. It does, because it is nothing can be more fundamental as will this kill me or not? Will this allow me to survive?
Yeah, it's not the next year. It's kind of let's survive the next hour or two.
Yeah,
and then we'll see.
Yeah, and I think there's a real amongst young people. Again, I'm talking quite broadly here, but I'd say that there's a real level of anxiety that I actually think has been brought about by social media and the internet, and people's propensity to just stay indoors and constantly monitor other people's opinions and voices. I'm not sure how healthy that is. Whereas when you're in a wilderness situation, you're just either on your own or with a partner or a small group. You don't have time really to think, what will others think of me? Like, how can I make a statement? Because all those things are just gone with the wind.
Yeah. I think going out there into the wilderness camping, either by yourself or with a friend or a partner, there's nothing more recalibrating and grounding than that. And I think in this day and age, that sort of recalibration and centering and grounding is definitely prescribed for the vast majority of people, and I think a lot of people stand to benefit from it.
Absolutely, yeah. I couldn't have put it better myself. I mean, the recalibration of appreciation of nature, life, friendships, relationships, out with your partner, around the fire, you'll probably cover some topics that you never thought you would normally.
No, because you're almost like afforded the headspace away from your day-to-day manic life, and you're just staring at a fire. You've got no choice but to talk about the things that matter. Yeah,
absolutely. And you have no stimulus to judge. You have no stimulus like, let's watch The Voice together and let's judge how people sing, or right. Look at that look at what they're wearing, or that person's fat. Like, none of those judgments sort of disappear because you don't have those stimuluses, which ultimately are just creating negativity, really. So
right, I think you're right. It's so right about the stimuli thing. There's none of these stimuli, external stimuli, superfluous external stimuli that ultimately bring you no value, vying for your attention. And so you're forced to almost either go into introspection when you're there by yourself, or discover the true qualities of the person or the human you happen to be spending your time with there.
Yeah, so true. And I think introspection is a great quality that comes out of wilderness experiences, whether those are survival experiences or just out in the wilderness. And I think a lot of people pursue introspection through alcohol or marijuana, and so many people get there. But again, as Alan Watts would say, they're getting there through a forced, controlled substance. They're not getting there on their own or with the universe and the environment around them.
Yeah, your full sort of sensory experience isn't a full experience at all. It's tainted by an external substance, and so in that sense, it's not the true you, and then by its sense, it's polluted, and it's almost a way of hiding maybe from the true you. But I think if you go out into the wilderness sober and just experience sobriety in the fullness of the wilderness, it almost forces you to, in that pureness and in that silence, to look at yourself in a healthy way without any prejudgment or anyone to judge your actions in that moment. It's sort of, you're there laid bare, and you're sort of allowed to mull over yourself in your own time, and there's no pressure to be having done X, Y, and Z by a certain deadline. Nothing like that.
Yeah, it's the ultimate meditation, and
oh yeah,
it's quite scary as well. Like the first time you wild camp on your own or with a friend, you know, and you have no cell service, you feel so isolated and lonely, but you also feel this adrenaline rush and this excitement, and you start to you realize in the absence of stimulus, you start to explore parts of your mind that you never thought possible, And
yeah, I mean, parts of your mind that have probably never been, or pretty much dormant for the vast majority of your time, because your attention's robbed by all of these stimuli vying for your attention. You're sort of, like you say, that there's this almost survivalist hunter-gatherer that is the majority of what you are, really, genetically.
yeah,
We've only had this crazy technological revolution when we sort of sit in offices and cubicles for the last few years, and ironically, that's the unnatural bit. The natural bit is the one, you out there in the wilderness by yourself, and by doing that now, you're getting back in touch with actually who you really are.
yeah, yeah. That's a very good way of putting it, really. You know, acknowledging the amount of our genetic DNA that thrives off, you know, that hunter-gatherer state, and getting back in touch with that almost feels like a homecoming.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't put it better myself. Yeah, it's a homecoming, because that is mostly what you are.
Exactly, yeah. That is mostly what you are. That is 99% of what you are. Well, I think in terms of wilderness and bushcraft survival, I think we've really covered most of the stuff I wanted to, really. I mean, I think the main take-homes that I wanted people to get out of this was, you know, that philosophical side of that hunter-gatherer side of human DNA that we've just touched, but also, you know, some basic tenets on the essential tools and measures to take, super shelters, and also things like don't eat anything unless you know what it is, especially plants, but also another big one is the more you know, the less you need. And the more you know, the more you're able to fashion things from nothing and create things that will allow you to survive that, you know, a few moments ago you thought were just useless objects on the floor of the forest.
Yeah, and I think getting back in touch with that sort of hunter-gatherer background that we all come from is probably very sort of grounding and inspiring, but also comes with a lot of hard work and almost recalibration back to relearning those skills and knowledge and bits of bushcraft long lost. Yeah.
And to touch very briefly on medicinal magic, and this actually links to what we were talking about in our previous podcast on it was 2 episodes back on the medicated America and all these you know, artificially created drugs that have some quite serious side effects. There are the woods and the outdoor environment is peppered with medicines that we never thought possible. I mean, a lot of people who suffer from angina or heart attacks will know that taking an aspirin hourly will reduce symptoms. Even you know, a small pool of people will know that chewing on the bark of white willow acts as an aspirin. So
really,
you know, yeah. So if you're ever out in the wilderness with a loved one or anyone, and you come across a situation where they're suffering from severe chest pains, angina, or actually a heart attack, God forbid, you know, it's great to have a little bit of white willow bark, and it will alleviate the symptoms if they chew and suck on it.
Wow, that's amazing knowledge. I had no idea.
Yeah, and this is great for England, because England's full of white willows, all over Britain. And there's just so many little tricks of nature that are out there. I mean, that are really able to alleviate or get rid of certain ailments. I mean, bearberry, which is native across most of Canada, as far north as the Arctic Circle, can treat UTIs, kidney stones. People have even used it to treat gonorrhea.
Right.
I mean, it's a multi-use berry that, by making an infusion out of, made of the leaves, you can treat all these things. You can treat gallstones, gout, and a bunch of other things with it.
Yeah, modern medicine has obviously done its wonders, but I think we have to appreciate where all of the inspiration behind the synthesized chemicals comes from, right? To a greater or larger extent, they're all inspired or derived from naturally occurring compounds in plants.
Yeah. That's very true. There's so much natural element to many synthesized drugs that we use to treat problems. So with that in mind, when you're out getting in touch with your hunter-gatherer self, or you're out surviving in general, you need to be aware of the medicinal magic that is completely peppered into all the plants and shrubs around you. Again, it's just a matter of knowing which ones to use so that you don't go down that dark road of taking the wrong plant.
Yeah, it's all about having that knowledge. And, in the past, this would have been passed down from father to son, from mother to daughter, and obviously that tacit knowledge with time has become redundant and then has been lost. But yeah, it's fascinating to get back in touch with that and find out these little nuggets of potentially gold, right? If you just, for example, the white bark example you gave is something I'd no idea was a thing, but now, if I ever do find myself, God forbid, in such a situation, I'd know what to do.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if an 11-year-old boy knows that, and he's gone out camping with dad might be pretty overstressed with work or a little on the tubby side, and dad has a heart issue or suffers from angina, the kid can give him that to chew on, and it's going to really alleviate those symptoms until either search and rescue arrives or you're able to walk back to the car or the truck you're driving.
No, invaluable, certainly in some, like the context you just mentioned. It's fascinating.
Yeah, it really is fascinating.
Life-saving.
Life-saving, yeah, absolutely.
This is what, ultimately, all of these survival techniques we've spoken about today, it's all, a lot of these are potentially life or death, and it's amazing how much just having the knowledge of when to do the right thing, or when to pick this berry, or when to administer this bark or this tea can really be the difference between life and death.
Yeah, totally. And if you're doing, say, a 10-day camp out in the bush, and you've got sort of a long-term chronic problem, it's even interesting to tinker with something more natural to treat that and just see what the effects are. Instead of using something your doctor's prescribed you, why not give the natural remedy a try? As long as you vetted and checked that it's right, go ahead with that, right, and see if it actually alleviates your ailment in a more effective way.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I think dealing with, like we talked about in the previous episode about medicated America, always better to deal with the issue before it arises, so dealing with the root causes and trying to prevent them from occurring rather than the problem once it has materialized, because then you're almost just putting out fires. And I think more often than not you find the natural medicines are best sort of tailored to that preventative approach. And because generally speaking, if you choose the right one for the right ailment, they have less in the way of side effects and sort of adverse impacts.
Yeah. The mitigation of side effects is huge when it comes to natural remedies, and that's why a lot of people go to one of the simplest weeds, and that's the dandelion, common weed, native to so many northern hemisphere and southern hemisphere environments, and
a beautiful flower as well.
A beautiful flower and a diuretic, but totally useful if you want to treat arthritis or liver problems, even eczema and other skin conditions are actually treated by the correct preparation and consumption of dandelion. So, give it a try, even if you live in the city. City parks are full of dandelions.
Right, I'm off. I'm going down to the common and rip up.
Get down to Hyde Park. Start hunting rabbits and picking up dandelions.
I wouldn't mind trying a London squirrel. I think it's probably quite a gamey meat, probably not dissimilar to a grouse.
No, well, London squirrels have got massive muscles on their legs, so you could probably get some meat off that.
There'll be some morsels there.
Yeah. Well, I think we've covered everything we wanted to on this episode. I really hope that we've given some people inspiration to get out there and try the outdoor life. At the very least, just try the outdoor life a little bit if you can.
Yep.
And just to bear in mind those do's and don'ts of winter survival, and those memorable aspects that will help you survive in a potentially life-threatening situation. But other than that, I think we've covered what we wanted to, Brother Bear, and I would love for you to inform our audience on what the next edition is going to focus on.
Well, it's been an absolute pleasure and an education, Leo.
Thank you.
Actually, you've set me up for failure there. I don't know which one I'm going to do next. There's a few topics I'm juggling at the minute.
No, that's fine.
So I'm sorry, guys. You're just going to have to find out when it's published. But for now, I'll keep you hanging, and I won't tell you what's coming up next. Just be in the knowledge and that it'll be the best podcast ever. Because I think with every podcast, Leo, we're finding we're improving incrementally.
Yeah. And
we're discovering and finding new what works, what doesn't work. And I think this podcast has been up there with the best, if not, probably one of the best we've done so far, because it's just come across, I think, more naturally than any of the others.
Yeah, for sure. It is a journey. And yeah, keep everyone hanging on the subject matter of the next one. Keep them hanging.
Good, Brother Bear. Awesome. It's been a pleasure, mate.
It's been a pleasure, matey. And until next time, have a good one. Over and out.
Cheerio. Over and out.